Picture this. It's a cold winter morning in 1558, and the most powerful palace in England has become a house of horrors. Servants whisper prayers as they hurry past the royal chambers, covering their noses with perfumed cloth. The stench of death itself seeps through stone walls that have witnessed centuries of royal splendor. But this isn't the aftermath of battle or plague. This is something far more terrifying. Inside those chambers lies a queen, still breathing, still clinging to power, yet her body is already rotting away while her heart still beats. This is the story of Mary Tudor, a woman whose name would forever be stained with blood, whose death would become as notorious as her life. They called her Bloody Mary, but what they whispered about in those final months was something far more disturbing than political cruelty. This is the tale of a queen whose body betrayed her as cruelly as fate had betrayed her dreams. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary story, I'd love to ask you to join our community of history enthusiasts. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, hit that like button if you're finding this fascinating, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us bring you more incredible stories from history's shadows. Now let me take you back to where it all began, to understand how a princess beloved by her father became the most feared monarch in English history. Mary's story reads like a fairy tale twisted into nightmare. Born in 1516, she was the apple of her father Henry VIII's eye, a cherished princess who received the finest education money could buy. Tutors from across Europe came to teach her languages, music, and philosophy. Foreign ambassadors wrote glowing reports about this intelligent, charming child who seemed destined for greatness. But Henry's desperate hunger for a male heir would transform his darling daughter's life into a living hell. When Henry decided to divorce Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, to marry the seductive Anne Boleyn, little Mary's world shattered overnight. One morning she was a princess, heir to the throne of England. The next morning she was declared illegitimate, stripped of her title, and forced to become a servant in her own half-sister's household. Imagine the psychological devastation. A 17-year-old girl suddenly told she was nobody, that her parents' marriage had been invalid, that everything she believed about herself was a lie. But Henry's cruelty didn't stop there. He forbade Mary from seeing her beloved mother, who was exiled to remote castles where she slowly died of what many suspected was poison. Mary herself lived under constant threat of execution. Henry's agents made it brutally clear that her continued defiance could result in her head being separated from her shoulders. Just like so many others who had crossed the king, the isolation was perhaps even more devastating than the threats. Mary was cut off from friends, from comfort, from any source of human warmth. She was watched constantly, her letters read, her movements restricted. The confident, joyful child gradually transformed into a suspicious, bitter young woman whose only refuge was her Catholic faith. This faith became her lifeline, but it also became the seed of the fanaticism that would later define her reign. The physical toll of this psychological torture was immediately visible. Mary, who had been a healthy, robust child, began suffering from chronic headaches, severe menstrual problems, and what we would now recognize as depression and anxiety. Her body was already beginning to break down under the relentless stress, setting the stage for the medical nightmare that would consume her final years. Perhaps most tragically, this period taught Mary that power was absolute and mercy was weakness. She learned from her father that even family bonds could be severed for political gain, that survival required ruthless determination. The warm, loving child was being systematically replaced by a woman who would show no compassion to those she viewed as enemies. When Henry finally acknowledged Mary as his heir in 1544, the damage was irreversible. The princess had been replaced by a woman whose capacity for trust had been permanently destroyed, whose understanding of power had been warped by years of humiliation and fear. This broken woman would soon inherit the throne of England, carrying with her all the psychological scars of her traumatic youth. By the time Mary seized power in 1553, she was already consumed by an impossible dream that would define and ultimately destroy her reign. At 37, considered elderly for a woman of her era, she clung desperately to the hope of bearing a Catholic heir who would permanently restore England to the Catholic fold. This obsession would lead to one of the most pathetic episodes in royal history. Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain was a political calculation that became a personal disaster. Philip, 11 years younger and already showing signs of the Habsburg mental instabilities, viewed Mary not as a wife but as a useful tool for Spanish ambitions. The wedding was a cold, formal affair that witnesses described as more funeral than celebration. Mary, desperate for love and a child, threw herself into the marriage with enthusiasm that Philip found both embarrassing and repulsive. Then came the phantom pregnancies that turned the royal court into a theater of collective delusion. Mary's abdomen swelled dramatically. She experienced morning sickness, and she felt what she believed to be a baby moving inside her. Physicians, terrified of contradicting their queen, confirmed her condition despite growing private doubts. The royal cradle was prepared, wet nurses were hired, plans were made for celebrating the Catholic heir's birth. But months passed, and no child appeared. Mary's belly remained distended, but no labor pains came. She spent hours in prayer, begging God to deliver the child she was convinced she carried. While courtiers exchanged worried glances, and foreign ambassadors sent increasingly skeptical reports to their governments, the woman who ruled England with absolute authority was powerless against her own body's cruel deception. The medical reality was almost certainly related to the same disease that would eventually kill her. Modern physicians believe she suffered from ovarian or uterine tumors that caused abdominal swelling and hormonal changes mimicking pregnancy. The psychological impact was devastating. Each failed expectation drove Mary deeper into despair and religious mania. Convincing her that God was punishing her for England's sins, these failed pregnancies shattered whatever remained of Mary's emotional stability and convinced her that England's Protestant heretics were somehow preventing God from blessing her with an heir. This delusion would fuel the murderous religious persecution that defined her reign and forever stained her legacy with blood. What followed was one of the most systematic campaigns of religious terror in English history. The Marian persecutions that began in 1555 represented a 3-year bloodbath that would earn Mary her infamous nickname. But to understand the true horror of what Mary unleashed, we must recognize this wasn't merely political oppression. It was the manifestation of a woman's complete psychological breakdown channeled through state power into sanctified ardor. The burnings began with Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop who had annulled Henry's marriage to Mary's mother. Mary's personal involvement revealed the depths of her vindictive nature. She forced Cranmer to watch his colleagues burn alive before his own execution, hoping to break his spirit. When Cranmer thrust his hand into the flames first, declaring it the hand that had signed documents against her mother, Mary was reportedly seen smiling, one of the few times witnesses recorded genuine pleasure on her increasingly gaunt features. Over 280 men, women and children were burned alive during Mary's reign. Their deaths were carefully orchestrated as public spectacles designed to terrorize the population into religious submission. Mary personally reviewed many cases, often demanding additional opportunities for heretics to recant, not from mercy, but because she believed forced conversions under threat of death were spiritually meaningful. What made Mary's persecution particularly horrifying was her personal attention to suffering details. She insisted condemned heretics receive sermons before execution, hoping to save their souls even as she condemned their bodies to agony. She corresponded with bishops about specific cases, sometimes demanding particularly stubborn heretics be subjected to additional tortures before burning. The most disturbing aspect was Mary's conviction that she was performing divine mercy. In her increasingly unhinged correspondence, she described the burnings as necessary medicine for England's spiritual sickness. She genuinely believed that burning heretics alive would save not only their souls, but all English souls. This delusion allowed her to watch executions with what witnesses described as religious ecstasy, seeing purification of her realm in the flames. Most tragically, the persecution achieved the opposite of Mary's goals. Rather than crushing English Protestantism, the burnings created martyrs whose stories would fuel anti-Catholic sentiment for centuries. Mary's victims died with such courage and dignity that they inspired rather than terrorized the population. The queen who sought to save England's soul through fire had instead ensured Catholicism would forever be associated with cruelty and foreign domination. By 1557, Mary's deteriorating condition had become impossible to conceal, despite desperate attempts to maintain royal health fiction. The woman once described as having pleasant appearance and dignified bearing was transforming into something that horrified even loyal servants. Her skin took on a sickly yellow hue, while her body began swelling in unnatural, disturbing ways. The most noticeable symptom was grotesque abdominal distension, initially mistaken for pregnancy, but now clearly indicating something sinister. Mary's belly protruded so dramatically she could barely fit into royal robes, accompanied by hardness that physicians found deeply troubling. Modern analysis suggests advanced ovarian or uterine cancer, possibly complicated by liver disease, conditions invariably fatal in the 16th century. The pain was constant and excruciating, transforming Mary into a figure of perpetual agony who could find no comfortable position. Court records describe her spending entire nights pacing chambers, unable to lie down due to suffering intensity. Her distress sounds, moaning, weeping, occasional screams, could be heard throughout the palace, creating dread that affected everyone nearby. Her digestive system essentially ceased functioning normally, leading to severe constipation, followed by violent diarrhea that left her weak and dehydrated. The queen, who had maintained strict royal protocols, was now frequently too ill to eat, and when she attempted food, she often vomited immediately. The waste products of her failing body produced odors so foul that servants were reluctant to approach despite punishment risks. The jaundice yellowing Mary's skin was accompanied by darkening that gave her increasingly corpse-like appearance. Her eyes, once bright and commanding, became sunken and yellowed, while skin took on grayish undertones, making her look more dead than alive. Courtiers who had known her for years reported shock at her transformation, describing her as resembling a walking corpse rather than living monarch. Perhaps most disturbing were mental state changes accompanying physical deterioration. Constant pain and knowledge her body was failing led to delusional thinking beyond earlier religious obsessions. She began seeing enemies everywhere, convinced Protestant conspirators were causing her illness through witchcraft or poison. Her paranoia became so severe, she refused food not personally prepared and tasted by trusted servants. In the final months of 1558, Mary Tudor had become something defying easy categorization, neither fully alive nor mercifully dead, but trapped in a grotesque state that horrified all witnesses. Her body had begun decomposing while she still drew breath, a medical nightmare that turned the royal court into something resembling a charnel house. The smell of decay emanating from the queen's quarters was so overwhelming that servants had to be rotated frequently. Even hardened courtiers found excuses to avoid her presence. Skin lesions that began as small discolorations spread across Mary's body like corruption maps, turning black and weeping fluids that stained bedding and clothing. Her extremities were particularly affected by the mysterious disease consuming her. Mary's fingers and toes began blackening and developing texture witnesses described as resembling leather, left too long in sun. Nails on hands and feet became thick, discolored, and began separating from underlying flesh, creating wounds that refused to heal. The transformation of Mary's face was perhaps most disturbing. Features that had once marked her as Henry VIII's daughter became increasingly unrecognizable as disease progressed. Her cheeks hollowed dramatically while skin stretched tight across her skull, giving skeletal appearance that made courtiers cross themselves when encountering her. Sleep became impossible for the dying queen, not only from constant pain, but because lying down seemed to accelerate fluid pooling in her diseased body. Mary spent final weeks sitting upright in a specially constructed chair, dozing fitfully while servants managed increasing bodily fluid flows her failing systems could no longer contain. Despite obvious condition hopelessness, Mary clung to life with tenacity that both impressed and horrified contemporaries. She seemed driven by absolute refusal to accept that her mission to restore Catholic England would die with her, continuing to issue heretic persecution orders even as her voice became too weak to be heard across a room. On the morning of November 17, 1558, royal apartments at St. James's Palace had become scenes resembling medieval hell visions. Mary Tudor, the woman who had sought burning heresy out of England, was herself being consumed by internal fire no amount of prayer or medical intervention could extinguish. Final hours of Mary's life were marked by convulsion series that shook her entire body despite extreme weakness. Witnesses described her movements as almost supernatural, as if some beyond human force was wrestling with her soul as it prepared departing corrupted flesh. The sounds she made during these episodes terrified even priests who came to perform last rites. The actual death moment came with surprising suddenness after weeks of prolonged agony. At approximately 6 in the morning, Mary's labored breathing simply stopped, with no final words or dramatic gestures, marking the end of one of England's most controversial reigns. The silence that followed was so complete, servants initially thought she might simply be unconscious. When servants began preparing her body for burial, they discovered corruption evident in life had progressed far beyond anyone's imagination. Parts of her body had essentially mummified while she was still alive, while other areas showed active decomposition signs, making funeral preparations particularly challenging. This immediate transformation of England following Mary's death was so rapid and completed seemed to erase her entire reign almost overnight. Elizabeth's first act as queen was halting all religious prosecutions, and within days, Protestant exiles began returning to England in coordinated campaigns to reclaim religious landscape. In centuries following Mary Tudor's agonizing death, her legacy became a cautionary tale about religious extremism, dangers, and ultimate futility of attempting to reverse historical change through violence. The woman who had dreamed of being remembered as Catholic England's restorer instead became a symbol of everything English Protestantism defined itself against. Mary Tudor's story reminds us that power, no matter how absolute it appears, is always temporary, that human suffering respects no crown or title, and that sometimes the most dramatic endings in history come not with grand gestures or famous last words, but with the simple, terrible silence of a breath that never comes again.